my name's Hannah. Just kind of a brief kind of introduction. My background mainly is in anthropology. So the bulk of my very modest academic career has been based in anthropology, sociology, and religious studies. And yet, at the same time, my father's a professor of clinical psychology. So in many ways, I think I've been primed for pluralism because much of my life has been about kind of, seeing where these two different places can kind of entwine with each other and what they can learn from each other. So I think one of the things that's really exciting about pluralistic psychotherapy is the space that it potentially provides for these kind of dialogues, and looking at where we can actually build links between things rather than leaving different disciplines in their own kind of discrete unit. I think it's really exciting about how much work is being done at looking at creating an environment of genuine collaboration. So it's in the spirit of that I kind of wanted to kind of think about how we can kind of meet cross-cultural selves. So there's a numerous number of things that one could talk about when thinking about culture. So I've kind of chosen some of the things that have kind of cropped up over the years that I hope would be really interesting. And I'm thinking particularly, I wanted to focus this talk particularly on this issue of selfhood, because I've noticed there's a lot of stuff kind of circulating about what the self means and about what that means in regards to cultural self. So kind of trying to see how anthropology and pluralistic psychotherapy might have a kind of dialogue together. These are kind of tentative ideas, so I'm really keen to hear any kind of thoughts and challenges or whatever. But just before I start, I'd like to say thank you to my pluralistic support network who encouraged me to do this. Annie, Marina, Pam, Paula, Pearl, Teresa, and Yana, who gave some really helpful feedback. And in the spirit of collaboration, I must acknowledge that they really helped to kind of put this talk together. Okay, so firstly, the term other is quite frequently used in psychotherapy, particularly within psychotherapy literature. And I think particularly within kind of humanistic psychotherapeutic approaches, there's this emphasis, I think, on using the term other to highlight the uniqueness of our clients, that each and every client that we have is unique. And there, of course, is an ethical rationale to that as well. But I've kind of found that there are times when I've found the term other to be it makes me a little bit uneasy, and I've been kind of curious about that, because it's not, I don't disagree with this, this isn't a criticism of this particular literature, but I think kind of what came up with me from considering that my background is in anthropology is that, we're conscious of the fact that othering can be a destructive and a divisive act. And I mean, we can see this playing out in all kinds of different ways within our contemporary society. And anthropology has, I think, been quite critical about not only how we meet others, so how we engage and understand and all those kind of things, but also about how we make sense of other people, how we make sense of others, and kind of really drawing a lot of critical attention to this term other. So people like Edward Syed, for example, have written quite a lot about how we can involve in these exotic romanticisms of other cultures in a way that probably says far more about us than it does about them. So his book Orientalism was really kind of has been quite kind of influential in that kind of area. So I think that's kind of interesting. So maybe perhaps the term other is something that we can hold lightly, or something at least that we can explore the different facets of what that term actually means to us. But I think what's also kind of really interesting, particularly thinking about the relationship between culture and mental health, and culture and selfhood, thinking about kind of our contemporary Western climate, is that we're starting to see more and more people kind of making points about the way about our culture and being critical about our culture, and particularly making this link between mental health and how it relates to, for example, capitalist structure. So if you look at the work of James Davies, or the work of Johann Hari, or the book Mental Health in Crisis by Voss, Roberts and Davies, which came out a couple of years ago, we'll see that, there are people who are working within the mental health profession who are also kind of trying to understand how it is embodied within its kind of wider cultural network. And I think this kind of joins a kind of a growing kind of rise of approaches that have really actually caused us to question what actually we mean by mental health and the consequences that this kind of terminology has. And I think if we look back to the history of mental illness, we can see that, you know, and thinking again about a sense in which there's a cultural inheritance that we have that shapes our kind of cultural ideas and values and norms. We find that we've tended, particularly within Western cultures, to have this kind of cultural dichotomy of madness and sanity, which in some ways equates to the dichotomy that has been around, and unfortunately we're starting to see this circulating within certain far-right ideologies, of this idea about a dichotomy between primitive and civilized. And what I think is quite important to bear in mind is that generally madness is characterized by the sane and primitive is characterized by the civilized. So there's a sense in which this is always about how we're making sense of something that we believe that we're not. And there's always kind of problems with that. An anthropologist called E. Valentine Daniel, who's done a lot of work on violence and anthropology, has kind of called in certain questions about, you know, the way in which civilization does not want to look at the darker sides of what it does, how it likes to have a very kind of particular view about what it is, and also what it's not, and that actually things may be far more complex. Okay. But I think one of the things that's really kind of interesting about a pluralistic approach, and that's really kind of been emphasized, is this issue, I think, about ethics and about an attitude of ethics and an attitude of collaboration. And I think one of the things that's also really interesting and important to note within kind of psychotherapy and anthropology is this sense for humane purpose. What actually is the purpose of doing what we do? And rather than just kind of following a set of standards that have been decided upon by whoever and continuing that without any criticism, we found that a number of individuals are kind of contributing from, I think, a position of ethics about actually thinking about the humanity of what we're doing. And I really love this quote from Carl Rogers, who kind of says that man's inability to communicate is a result of his failure to listen effectively. So I think kind of looking at particularly the person-centered approaches, you know, what's really interesting is that the core conditions that Rogers kind of developed represent a way of being of ourselves and of being in contact with others that ultimately is grounded in letting people be who they are. I think that's really important. And in a way, I think that correlates with anthropology. So here we have Ruth Benedict, who argues that the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. I return to this quote over and over and over again because I think actually what we can contribute to make the world safe for human differences is an incredibly important pursuit. So again, there's a sense, I think, within anthropology of this desire to embrace and appreciate cultural difference and a desire for people to be able to be as they are. That's setting out. But I think also what we're finding is that we're starting to recognize that psychology and psychotherapy are cultured in a certain way. So the cross-cultural psychologist Pitu Langwani has kind of made this great point that things do not appear within a social vacuum. You know, nobody kind of waved a magic wand and psychotherapy and psychology appeared. They developed over time and were influenced by all kinds of different things. In fact, I was reading a paper the other day that suggests that psychotherapy has its roots within medieval confessional practices. It's really interesting. But I think if we look at this image on the right that somebody has drawn up, which is based around kind of representing some of the main figures within the development of psychological approaches, they all have something quite noticeable in common, which is kind of interesting. But I think what's kind of also interesting here is that from looking at this picture, it took me a while before I could name everyone. Actually, I had to do a few Google searches for that. But I'm also curious as to whether or not this actually tells the full story. And I think one of the things that we're finding, particularly through social media, there are various kind of memes and posts that do the rounds of trying to reveal what have previously been seen as hidden histories. So, for example, there are a number of posts that look at women who were actually incredibly instrumental in some of the kind of major scientific developments and other kind of areas that have influenced where we are today, and yet they're almost never mentioned. And I think this is similar within psychology and psychotherapy. There are a number of practitioners who will have slipped between the gaps and have been kind of lost, I think, in a sense. So in a way, I think it's interesting what we choose to orient to in our history. You know, who are the people that we choose to focus on? How do we choose to present our history? And how does that kind of reflect our own values? Again, of course, you know, contemporary practitioners have kind of noted that the development of theory both reflects and was influenced by Western cultural values and norms. So again, it is not this kind of neutral sense that is universally applicable. And a similar timeline exists and context exists for anthropology as well. But what's kind of interesting about anthropology, and I think this is kind of also useful thinking about our engagement with others and our engagement in power and culture and all those kind of areas. In anthropology, there's a recognition that it has its roots within colonialism. And anthropologists have kind of struggled, I think, since then to kind of make sense of that. And in a way, I think, to move constructively beyond that, because we can't deny that there was, you know, a lot of kind of beginnings of anthropological work went on during that period. But the way in which I think that kind of an owning of that enables us to kind of move forward. And in a sense, I think there's in some ways an influence as to why a lot of anthropologists are very committed to social justice and social development. So, for example, developmental anthropology is quite a strong strand that involves actually trying to work collaboratively with communities with a view of for kind of social justice and equality. But this sense in which, you know, we're actually trying to make sense of our history in a way that is honest, I think is kind of quite important. This, I think, is a really interesting, again, kind of going to this idea then, right, of that perhaps there are things that have slipped through the gaps. So there are these aspects of history that have been lost in the record, if you like. There was there's a couple of articles that have done the rounds recently, and it's articles like this that actually do shift me towards staying on social media, because sometimes I feel you don't want to do that, but then you would miss this kind of stuff. So what's really interesting with this is that what's been brought to light is that Abraham Maslow actually spent some time in 1938 with the Siksika people, who are part of the Blackfoot Confederacy and Blackfoot Nation, which are based in Canada and I think it's Montana in the USA. And, you know, he actually worked with anthropologists during that time. So this is another thing. We do find psychologists and anthropologists actually often are having kind of dialogues and friendships and relationships together, which is really exciting. So some people have now kind of raised this point about to what extent he was influenced in the development of his idea of, you know, a hierarchy of needs. Yeah, actually, I think that this kind of looking at these two representations of a hierarchy of needs, although bearing in mind Maslow didn't actually organize it into a pyramid, but I think it's kind of helpful here, is that from the Western perspective, the idea of this hierarchy of needs is very much about meeting a set of needs that will allow one to access self-actualization. So it's kind of looking at all the things that need to be in place in order for the self to become actualized. Whereas if we look at from a different perspective, so from the indigenous communities within North America, what we find is that actually self-actualization starts first. One is born, in a sense, becoming fully self-actualized. So the process of life, actually, that is also kind of influenced by your culture, is about this rise through community actualizations to cultural perpetuity. I think this is really kind of important because there is a difference between the role of the individual within societies that really prize the individual as being kind of the seat of power and authority, and as being a discrete agentic agent within itself, and the role of the self within communities where actually one's relationship with others is far more fluid and far more binding. So I think it's kind of interesting, again, thinking about how different perspectives look at how selfhood reflects this concept of being and being in the world, and what constitutes the kind of norm for that. So again, by that, but I kind of think that this is, you know, so kind of looking at these two different kind of perspectives, I think it's really interesting to think, you know, actually that's really interesting because that's quite different. I wonder what that's about. And I think that kind of sense of wonder and excitement, certainly that's something that anthropology really instilled in me as kind of an 18-year-old undergraduate. I felt going to lectures and hearing, you know, finding out about different cultures was kind of being transported into this magical, enchanting world of what it is to be human. But I think having that sense of being really fascinated and interested in what these different kind of perspectives can tell us, and being able to have a dialogue where we learn from each other is really, really important. And I think that pluralism potentially provides a platform for us to do that. Okay, so for the rest of this talk, then I've kind of wanted to look at, in a sense, how we can maybe weave together. And I think that's important, rather than kind of maintaining things in these kind of discrete ways, but actually weaving together different kind of cultural perspectives in a mutually inclusive and kind of genuinely collaborative sense. I kind of wanted to focus on three particular areas. So firstly, this kind of thinking about some potential cultural insights for client experience and how we might influence psychotherapy with an anthropological lens. And then for the second two, kind of thinking about this role of social connectedness and community connectedness. So I wanted to kind of explore the concept of relational depth in reference to work on collective effervescence and communitas. And then lastly, kind of thinking about this idea of plural selfhood, multi-voicedness or multiple selves, and actually kind of what some of the spirit possession literature can tell us about that. So without further ado, thinking about kind of cultural influences on client experience. Time, I think, is actually kind of an interesting concept. And I think if we look at different modalities, we find that different psychotherapeutic modalities orientate to clients' time in different ways. So it's kind of time is a strange thing, because I think it's something that we generally take for granted. The sun rises, the sun sets, there's day and night, we go through the years, through the seasons. The day starts at whatever time, it ends at whatever time, we do this at this time, this at this time. So time is very much considered to be a sort of a foundational kind of construct for our life. But, you know, an engagement, a genuine cross-cultural engagement kind of does potentially kind of ask us to be perhaps a little bit more fluid about that. I think what's interesting in regards to psychotherapeutic work is kind of the presence of the past and the presence on the here and now. So some practitioners prefer to focus very much on the here and now with their work with clients, whereas others prefer to focus actually on working through past events in order to kind of help where their clients are. So, but I think in some ways also for many practitioners there's this idea that therapy is a largely linear process. And I think bearing in mind the way that therapy exists within a kind of an institutional context where you have 6-12 weeks, that largely reinforces that kind of boundary. And of course, you know, we have sessions that last 15 minutes and they exist in this kind of particular room. In many ways, of course, that is culturally influenced. Who decided that sessions should be 15 minutes? Who decided where they should be? And I think what we're finding now is that actually people are now starting to think of other ways around that. So John McLeod noted earlier about, you know, actually therapy engaging within a natural environment, you know, walking and talking, for example, is becoming more popular. I think again, there's the idea of the significance of time as an experience that can be influenced by different factors. And of course, something that's becoming, I think, more becoming talked about a lot more within popular culture is the role of historical consciousness, and this idea that past events may script the present in very particular ways. So there's kind of stuff here relating to, for example, the presence of ancestors. Your ancestors are ever present, that they represent the continuation of society, and I could say symbolic, but not really, because they're, you know, they're our ancestors, but it's kind of what they mean for people, of these ongoing relationships with our culture and with our cultural heritage. And of course, this idea about cultural perpetuity, the idea that our communities continue even after we are gone, and what is our role in enabling that. And again, there's also this idea that, you know, that time is a theoretical concept, and this, again, kind of what I sort of touched a bit on earlier, is the idea of that history is neutral, that we tell history in a neutral way, and that we position individuals and cultures in terms of socially constructed time. And this is kind of interesting, I think, kind of from an anthropological perspective. You know, in the early anthropological theory, there was an idea that some of the communities that people were working with were indicative of this pre-industrialized time, that these, in a way, this was an embodiment of our past. So of course this is very much on a developmental scale, and there was actually kind of a strong feeling of romanticism about that, but also affection perhaps, but a sense in which it was also kind of quite patronizing. you know, in many ways, and I think we've kind of moved away from that. But it's kind of this idea about, you know, particularly influenced by the idea of social evolution and the ways in which societies have thought, again, that they progress upon this particular continuum, which is from being simplistic to becoming more complex. So if you're not at the same stage that Westerners are, then you must be further down that continuum. And so, of course, obviously, anthropologists have kind of questioned about that and thought about who actually makes those sorts of decisions. I think another thing that's becoming, that's talked about kind of more, is this issue about inter and transgenerational cultural trauma. So again, this idea that actually culture is part of our inheritance, that we are influenced by those who have gone before us. And we can be influenced by those who have gone before us in ways that we may not entirely be conscious of. I think what's kind of interesting, I mean, for my particular generation, you know, my grandparents were all active within the Second World War. You know, my parents were born in the few years after the end of the Second World War, and they were influenced by their results. And actually, as a child growing up, this kind of the recent history of the world wars was very much something that we encountered on a regular basis. So it would be that World War veterans would come into our schools and share their stories, and this sense of this monumental cultural trauma was palpable even with present day space. And I think, you know, and if we look at that, the NHS being kind of developed at the end of the Second World War, and actually what was kind of invested in that and what that signified in regards to moving forward, I think is kind of really interesting. It's recognizing that culture actually does act as a kind of, it's an inherited aspect. In a sense, we inherit different cultural scripts. And again, of course, we're having a kind of a growing awareness of just how significant cultural trauma is and how that is passed down through generations. So, for example, you know, slavery ancestry, war, diaspora, there's actually these experiences that are shared by a culture and how that actually influences cultural identity, and it's something that is shared between people. But I think what's also interesting is that, you know, there are scientific studies that are kind of corroborating or providing another lens into this. So there are various epigenetic studies that are actually looking at how particular traumas can influence our genetic makeup and how that might be inherited. And of course, I mean, we talk about cycles of violence and all of those kind of things that we have been doing for quite a long time. But just to kind of use a couple of examples of this, and I think this kind of brings in a notion about being mindful about culture and thinking about the cultural picture of things rather than just treating people individually as if, you know, trauma is seen as this discrete thing that only happens to a person. So, for example, Stefan Vine in 1999, who worked with Bosnian refugees, wrote a book that was literally called History is a Nightmare. He was working with people who felt that their history, their cultural history, literally was a nightmare. And even though after the end of the former Yugoslav war, there were various attempts to encourage recovery within Bosnia, we're all okay now, we're all moving on, it's past. What he argues is that, you know, the people that he was working with are saying that effectively they need only to look at their streets, their families, or themselves to be reminded of the horror that has preceded this time. They're literally surrounded by that history embodied within their landscape and within themselves. And Vine's work is particularly kind of, is a particularly resonant for me because when I was an anthropology undergraduate, my dissertation was looking at masculinity and trauma within Bosnian and Kosovan refugees in Derby, because we had there was a community of refugees from Bosnia and Kosovo in Derby at that time, and I spent, you know, quite a naive, really 19-year-old, spent quite a lot of time interviewing them about their experiences, which was a really useful experience just to say that stereotypes are easy to kind of come into contact with, but actually people are so much more varied than that. And it was, yeah, I changed a lot after some of the things that I heard there. But it was really, but also just incredible people, but also just how deeply traumatic kind of these events, and the sense of kind of a deep sense of loss over a particular cultural trauma, and that loss is so huge that actually moving forward feels as if it's an impossibility, that the shadow of the past becomes this kind of ongoing issue. There's also a wonderful chapter done by my friend Yana Galola, who is a Ukrainian person-centered psychotherapist, and she's written a chapter kind of looking at the development of Ukrainian psychotherapy and how it emerged at a kind of very particular time, so mainly around the 1990s. And she's written a lot about kind of the legacy of this kind of deep-rooted cultural trauma. And I wanted to include a quote from her because I can't say it any better. It's a really wonderful chapter. And she argues that therapists can facilitate recovery from trauma. We do come across individuals whose despair bears the psychic burden of memories associated with emotions of traumatic experience which exist separately. This despair in its turn increased our connection to that cultural trauma as a sort of counterweight, and despite the fact that we have had almost 30 years of independence. The person at the edge of external and internal reality faces a question of the meaning of his or her existence. This meaning is sharpened, and these meaningful landmarks are often actualized in therapy. And helping each individual to realize him or herself and his or her personal history in the social context means effectively to write a history of a whole people. One cannot ignore the need to live and realize the trauma of the past present. So I think Yana kind of shows so kind of beautifully about, you know, these two aspects of trauma as a personal experience and trauma as a cultural experience and how these things work together. It's a really great chapter. I really recommend it. And then, of course, I mean, I'm conscious of time. You know, I think we're aware, I hope we're aware now, there's a lot of research to support this, that kind of a resistance to or an ignorance of the cultural tapestries that our clients bring to the therapy room is harmful. You know, Dwight Turner, for example, has made kind of some fantastic points about this, and a Canadian psychologist called Roy Ridley as well, to argue that actually, you know, therapists that persist in denying that there is systemic racism, denying that the experience of racism of their clients, or trying to kind of cover it up, is extremely harmful for clients. And I think, you know, that we're at a stage here where that kind of harm cannot be ignored. Kind of something that I think is interesting is that, you know, kind of we've got a kind of comprehensive cross-cultural psychological and psychotherapy movement based in the 1960s that Peter Pedersen, for example, has said is a fourth force in classical psychotherapy. But sometimes it still feels as if it's largely at the edges. So again, Dwight Turner has kind of made a point, you know, diversity trainings, there seem to be a weekend tacked on here and there, and still, you know, students are saying, I don't feel included, I don't feel there's a space for me, I feel ostracized. I was really struck by Susan Cousins' talk last year when she was talking about giving a talk and it literally being on the outer edges of the main space, you know, kind of tucked away at a time and in a place where, you know, it's in a kind of external zone rather than being embedded within the kind of the main fabric of the event. And I think that's kind of important if we're going to persist in doing that. Why are we going to persist in doing that, basically? Of course, I'm sure that you're kind of well aware of the significance of power, class, ethnicity, and how all of these things play out within the therapy room. But I think it's also interesting to note that there have been attempts, I mean, more than attempts, actually, they're quite well established now, to adapt therapies to be more culturally sensitive. So, for example, I think CBT has 2 or 3 culturally sensitive, culturally adaptive forms now. And these things have arisen particularly over the last 10 to 20 years. So there is some evidence that actually we are taking culture a lot more seriously and taking our cultural relationships a lot more seriously as well. I think it's also kind of interesting, and I'm just going to sort of touch on this, thinking about the role of ritual and the role of rites of passage. I guess partly because kind of revisiting some of the literature on rites of passage, kind of wondering how similar that is to the kind of therapeutic process, and thinking about actually the role of ritual as a social event that recognizes and facilitates personal transformation, the sense that it may give a sense of direction that is socially embedded. So there's something very important about social embeddedness, social recognition of particular transformative experience of people, and the significance of group membership. My friend Leela Frondigan has kind of looked at that. She's a psychodramatist, and she's looked at that in regards to exploring the role of ritual within psychodrama itself. And she argues that rituals provide a rhythm for life, which I think is a wonderful expression, and has argued that in a way, the function of ritual is that it connects us to space, time, people around us, and the cosmos. So that actually that ritual has a space even within the texture of a psychotherapeutic approach itself. So again, I think thinking about, is there a ritual aspect to therapy? Might that be helpful? Could we employ different kinds of rituals? All of those kind of things. I kind of wondered about, actually, is there a way in which we could see therapy as a rite of passage in some way? I say this rather tentatively because it may land with you, it may not. But very basically, so this is the diagram that's based on, say, Van Gellep's 1909. So we're going back a little way here, but I still think it's a pretty good model. His idea about rites of passage that very briefly are, that we start in one state, we go through a period of separation, we separate from that, we go through this kind of liminal in betwixt period of kind of transformation, and then which leads on to a period where this is incorporated into a new self, and then you kind of emerge out of that. And actually, rites of passage play very important roles within certain society and within our own society. So marriage, for example, is a really obvious form of a rite of passage. You think about the fact that, traditionally the bride is kind of is led by her father and given to her husband by her father, and she through this ritualistic binding, she takes on a new name, and then she kind of emerges into this new position. So in this context, I was also wondering, okay, so how might this be indicative within therapy? So from looking at the processes of change as depicted within the trans-theoretical model, which was developed by Prochanska and Clementa and Norcross. So this was developed particularly for work with addictions, but it does have some more mainstream application. It's quite a major part of my own integrative training, so it's nice to revisit it again. But I wondered if you could see some kind of similar pattern here. So in some ways, perhaps, one thing that the trans-theoretical model argues is effectively how we help clients to move from pre-contemplation, so not being aware of what's going on, to kind of being aware of it, and then to gradually kind of preparing to work with it, action and maintenance. So if you can see this in regards to addiction, this maybe not being aware of addiction, and then being aware of it, and then actually working out about how to kind of transform that. But again, we can see the idea is a linear progression, a linear progressive one, although they do state that you can move back and forward between the different stages. So what we might find is that this, there's this space between pre-contemplation and contemplation, where something happens with a client where they come to think, I want to make some kind of change, and I'm going to seek therapy in order to do that. And so what we might see is that actually this space around kind of contemplation, preparation, so when actually the therapeutic work is done, is kind of similar perhaps to the liminal period. And then perhaps it's around this area of action and maintenance and actually how we start to incorporate the changes that we've learned about in therapy that constitutes a kind of incorporation of identity. So again, for separation, it might be that the client steps out of their everyday life to begin a therapeutic process. The liminarity period is a therapeutic work itself, and in betwixt state where there's a reconfiguration of self. And incorporation is where perhaps the client feels that the therapeutic processes help them to shift and to change. I think we all know that for many clients, therapy feels as if it is transformative in certain ways. Okay, so moving on then to kind of more of the social aspects, I didn't feel I needed to do a slide on relational depth because I feel you're probably all very familiar with that. But there do, from kind of reading that research, there do seem to be some similarities with two particular concepts that have been developed by kind of anthropologists and sociologists. The first one is Emile Durkheim's concept of collective effervescence. I think I love it. I love that term, collective effervescence. It's just really warm, exciting for me anyway, but maybe that's me. And what collective effervescence basically refers to is a profound, heightened sense of coming together of simultaneously mutual thought and action. And in a way, it's these kind of moments when actually we feel in this sense that they can act as a form of social glue. I mean, Durkheim effectively argued that, kind of a lot of religion is a representation of the self. So he would see that the worship of totems, for example, that totems represent a society, and effectively what is happening is that society is worshipping itself, which is kind of one interpretation, I suppose. But of course, collective effervescence may be focused around particular sacred objects, symbols, and people. And I've kind of chosen this picture of a football crowd because obviously we've had the Euro 2020 finals recently. And I was really struck, when Luke Shaw scores the goal like within about 5 minutes, I think it was. And they showed all the different things of people reacting to that moment. And I mean, I thought, well, that is collective effervescence. It's almost like it's a wave, like that people are kind of, you know, all acting as one together. And it's certainly an ecstatic kind of moment. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, effectively, somebody has kicked a ball into a net. And yet, that is not a very accurate description of what happens. So, I mean, I don't want to kind of make a point that football teams are particularly sacred objects, symbols, and people. However, you know, I think it's important about, particularly within international football, that actually these groups of people represent the society literally, and perhaps in kind of a sacred way. Unfortunately, and I think football crowds are a good example of this, this is not necessarily ecstatic joy and celebrating. Unfortunately, because it is related to events, it can change, and you can change it in quite unpleasant ways as well. So there's the power of the crowd and the psychology of that as well. But another area I think that's really interesting is the area of communitas. And you know, kind of Tim Olafson, who's kind of compared collective effervescence and communitas, has kind of argued that human existence solely within social structure would quickly stagnate and die without some kind of revitalizing force. Victor Turner, who's kind of one of the main figures behind communitas, has believed that force to be communitas. So basically, it's an acute point of community. So again, there's something about these heightened moments where people feel tightly bound together. It's where communities share in a common experience. And he kind of associates with these kind of periods of liminality. He was quite interested in the way in which communitas exists around the kind of established sort of social structure of people actually. What they're finding is a kind of egalitarian, you know, the joy of being together and being united. And what's kind of interesting is that he makes, you know, for those of you who are familiar with Martin Buber, he does make reference to Martin Buber's I Thou point in regards to how individuals meet each other during periods of communitas. Now, his widow, Edith Turner, and Victor Turner died in 1983. Edith Turner died 2013, I think. She wrote, I mean, this is a gorgeous book, and I just really love this cover. I love the looks on their faces, where she was kind of looking at communitas as a means of collective joy. You know, when life actually takes on a shared meaning, there is pleasure in shared experience, and that this can have a numinous or a heightened quality. There's a feeling of, you know, there's a special feeling of being together. And I thought that's so like some of the relational depth literature. So just to kind of quote Turner again, you know, the type of communitas that people desired, I think just to set context for here, you know, Turner was writing the end of the 60s. He was really interested in the kind of countercultural kind of hippie societies and how people were bonding in those sense. And his, you know, kind of comparing that to the way that the other communities and perhaps small scale communities kind of bonded together. And he would argue that, you know, the type of communitas desired is not the pleasurable and effortless comradeship that can arise between friends, co-workers and professional colleagues any day. It's not that it's a bad thing, but he's saying that's not what it's about. It's what people are seeking is a transformative experience that goes to the root of each person's being and finds in that root something profoundly communal and shared. So I thought that's really interesting, and it reminded me of relational depth refers to intense relational contact and enduring experiences of connectedness within the therapeutic relationship, so between these two people. These can be striking in the significance they have for the people involved. There's something really important here about this heightened feeling of social connectedness. And if these are feelings that we're yearning for, thinking about, you know, perhaps how we can kind of work with an understanding of that within a kind of psychotherapeutic setting. But also, I think what relational depth shows is that actually these kind of experiences can be facilitated within a psychotherapeutic setting. And there's a sense in which cases is embodied connectedness. It's not just kind of, I think that you care about me. This is I feel that you do, which is really interesting. And again, of course, lots of research continues to suggest that we are hardwired for connection. There's all the neurophysiology, neurobiology, work with people like Daniel Seeger and polyvagal theory. We are hardwired for connection. Our bodies respond to connection. in particular ways. So I think understanding what can and what may facilitate these moments and how they can be embedded into our everyday lives may be useful. Okay, so I'll quickly go to the next bit. So thinking then at this, I think another thing, this idea of the self as being plural, of a multiplicity of the self. And Nicola Blunden wrote a really gorgeous article about exploring inner pluralism and the potential for working pluralistically with clients and how this fits in with self-plurality. And I think what was also great is that, you know, kind of around about the time that this blog post was published, she also published an article with a client of hers that explored similar kind of things. And I thought, you know, that's such a fantastic way of actually exploring these issues, of working in such a genuinely collaborative sense. Again, one of the things that I think is kind of really important about her insights is, you know, recognizing that actually clients can experience the world from multiple vantage points, you know, and what then and their inner parts can actually disagree about important things. And you know, that I thought that's just really. If you've not read her article, please do, because it's really brilliant. Then there's kind of some similar stuff going on elsewhere around concepts like multi-voicedness. So Emma Kay, who is a researcher at the University of Roehampton and colleagues, have been exploring a particular qualitative method that may illuminate clients' experiences of multi-voicedness and client therapy relational dynamics. So they're kind of looking at ways in which, you know, I as this or I as that, and how, you know, again, it's thinking about the self as complex rather than the self as this kind of really concretized, agentic thing. And within my own modality, which is compassion-focused therapy, we do a lot of work with what we call multiple selves. And this is the kind of recognition of the significance of different emotional states. And indeed, therapeutic work may involve dialoguing with different parts of the self. So we might have a dialogue with our angry self, our sad self, our anxious self, and actually kind of see how they address certain particular positions. So this kind of brings me on to, you know, I mean, in a sense, okay, so I want to talk about spirit possession. Well, spirit possession is kind of interesting because effectively it involves a very interesting relationship with aspects of one's culture. Generally, the anthropological perspective, and I mean, here I'm kind of talking about more, I think, of spirit possession by human spirits, but of course, you know, the ability to be possessed by kind of spiritual, supernatural beings or deities or gods or whatever, is also quite commonplace. So, I mean, there's often been a kind of a functional perspective within anthropology on this, the idea that possession serves a purpose. So particularly in areas where women experience a lot of discrimination, that they're kind of barred from public space, possession by the spirits give them an authority to be able to say the things that they would like to say, but actually they can't under their own voice. So the idea is that, and actually the social group is united in its negotiation with their spirits, rather than actually kind of negotiating with the person actually. There's kind of problem. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of that approach, but I think in some ways, you know, there's similarities. I think into how some psychological theory has approached things, you know, similar sorts of experiences as well. But again, I think more and more people are saying yes, but what does this mean within its own context? People like Michael Lambeck, who've argued that what we're seeing, and this is an embodying of the weight of the past, the bearing of history, that possession is an embodiment of cultural perpetuity, you know, the way in which actually this is an engagement with our history. This is a way of living history. And again, but I think this idea is the significance of the idea that the self is not explicitly bounded by the body, but it can become entangled with other agentic selves. I think that's kind of really interesting. In a lot of cultures, this is, you know, this is a possibility. So, you know, just kind of quickly, kind of three studies, I think, that kind of show these kind of different aspects of that. Isabel Nabokov's work with the Tamil in Sri Lanka, she kind of found that there was a difference between invited and uninvited possession, and that this corresponded with the degree of control that a human host has over their spirit contact. So you would have examples of kind of an uninvited possession, where people literally were possessed by spirits against their will, and so the point of view was to engage in an exorcism ritual and to work that way to try and kind of rid that wherever possible. But of course, there's also spirit mediumship, where literally spirits are invited into the self to communicate. And this does seem to tally with the amount of control that a human host has. And again, she kind of also argues that, for the Tamil, they have a rich cosmology in which, the dead are yearning for life, in the afterworld. And that's actually very significant about kind of, living self-identity as well. Balin Gustafson has done a fantastic ethnography looking at spirit possession in Vietnam. And what was really interesting is that she wasn't expecting to find this. And yet she found that actually there's, looking at illness and illness narratives within Vietnam, and finding a connection between the presence of what are known as the Kong Ma, which are the angry dead. And this is to do with the fact that unfortunately a lot of people were lost, during the Vietnam War, and they were not able to be buried. So that's a terrible thing within that particular cosmological position. We actually need to have burial in order to process these kind of particular events. So there's also, I think, the trauma of that, of losing people that you love and not knowing what's happened to them. But it also kind of is met within the kind of cosmological, ontological sense of actually that these spirits cannot rest. So that she's kind of, it's a really, really kind of, it's harrowing, but it's a really, really brilliant photography. And finally, thing I thought was really interesting was Laurel Kendall's work on Korean shamanism. She kind of looked at in her paper in 1988 this idea that while we tend to see shamanism people like that set apart from their kind of society, that she found that actually for particular shamans who experienced a series of setbacks throughout their life, that actually by kind of coming together with their clients, they were able to build together, so collaboratively, a shared reality through their work together. So they could actually make sense of each other by working together. And in a sense, I think that's kind of one of the movements, with thinking about actually a potential way in which psychotherapy can be collaborative, about the sense in which actually what we kind of learn from each other, which leads on to this way in which, I think recognizing the sense in which people change us, I think is important, particularly I think in regards to terms of power. But, again, kind of looking at where there's the potential for dialogue and looking at similarities between things. There's a great book by Jeffrey, well, it was edited by Jeffrey Kotler and John Carlson, called The Client Who Changed Me, which is accounts from lots of different people about particular clients that have had a particular effect on them. And I think they bring up this point, a client brings up an issue and we realise as we are responding that it is one that we have not yet fully resolved. We talk about finding meaning in life and discovering new meanings for ourselves. Your decisions in our lives are based in part on dialogue we've had with clients, and on the parallel process continues. Clients actually can have a huge impact on us as well as we having an impact on our clients. So seeing it as a kind of a reciprocal process, I think, is potentially really important. This is kind of corresponded within some anthropological literature, with this being changed by cross-cultural encounters with one of those books that kind of changed my life. And it's an account of anthropologists who've had extraordinary experiences during their field work. And what's really interesting is that lots of the anthropologists who have such experiences, they're often consistent with one's host's culture, and that people are changed by them. So Edith Turner, who I mentioned earlier, actually recalls within this book an experience of working with a community. She actually saw a spirit come out of a fire. And this was an experience that members of the group were having, that had a particular context. So that she was seeing what her host community was seeing as well, which is really interesting. Of course, there is that point, I think, about if we move on to thinking about how we represent others. So in a sense, anthropologists, they go into the world, they go into their landscape. And in a sense, I think the difference within psychotherapy is that, clients come into our space generally. It's our space that they come into. I think that's really, really interesting about actually what we might learn from looking at those kind of different processes of us venturing into their clients venturing into our own space. And yet, of course, a lot of our psychotherapeutic work is about kind of working with our clients' world. So I think that kind of lends a sense in which, actually, how are the best ways for us to facilitate that? There's also, of course, an issue, I think, and this comes up, in regards to cross-cultural work, and I think Nadia's amazing poem that was played through the break kind of really, I mean, there's so many things I can say about this poem, was extraordinary. But I think one of the things that's important is, is being able to recognize within our own process, how strongly do we hold to our own ontological reality? How easy would it be for us to kind of put that aside and step into the world of our lives? Or are we actually going to experience some friction within us if we're encountering beliefs, for example, that are very different? I think that's a really interesting and important point of inquiry and part of our process. And again, I think, thinking again about, actually how are we representing others in our research output? Do they have any say? Thinking about perhaps the difference of, representing people as statistics, representing people with a sense of kind of a more sensuous, more holistic quality as much. But of course, recognizing that, of course, people are always filtered through us. And that's the thing about anthropology and psychology and psychotherapy, particularly in a research sense. The people that we work with generally are filtered through us because we are the ones that write the papers. So actually, how can we kind of engage in that process in as collaborative a way as possible? And I personally think that, but perhaps pluralistic values, a sense of recognizing that, everything is welcome to the table, and let's learn from each other and let's appreciate each other. I think potentially that could be really helpful. Thank you very much, and I've gone on longer than I wanted to, I'm afraid, but thank you very much for your time. I think we've got like 6 minutes if anybody has anything they want to share with each other. I mean, it doesn't have to be comments or questions, but things to just kind of share with each other.
Hannah, I really enjoyed the way that you kind of meshed together a kind of anthropological theory and the counseling and psychotherapy theory. And I liked your kind of dichotomy at the beginning of madness and sanity and primitive and civilized and all of that, and kind of wanting to turn that into a dialectic of complex, madness has got sanity within it, hasn't it? And sanity has got madness within it. I felt a bit uncomfortable with spirit possession and plural selves being kind of aligned there, because I think they are quite different experiences. So when you have plural selves, they're not external self, they're not from without. But I think, but it is interesting within the Native American tradition, there is this kind of twin spirit idea. I think also might be something that might be useful. People are experienced and kind of valued for having that multiplicity of but that's intrinsic to them rather than some kind of imposed thing from the outside. I don't know. Just wondered if you wanted to kind of comment.
No, I think that's a brilliant point, Nicola. And I think that's one of the things about it's actually really great to be able to present, because people can say that doesn't work. Because actually now you've said that, it's like, yeah, okay, actually, if that came across that it was that too tight a comparison, sure. I think actually that does a disservice to the work. I think that it was also bearing like a lot of my research with mediums, and I think what was really kind of interesting is the way that they would kind of they spoke about things. I suppose it's more about seeing there's a potential kind of link, but not to compare. And I think actually that's something that's important, isn't it? And I think the problem is maybe, as with many things I do, trying to do too many things. But it's kind of looking at where there may be links, but not comparing. And I think actually your point actually is, that's actually, I'm going to kind of write this down afterwards because it's really important, is looking actually about how we can kind of bring things together, but not contrasting things to say that this is like this, or this is, that makes sense, this is connected. And being able to also prioritize, being able to recognize what is specific. If that makes, thank you, Nicola, that's really, really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a criticism, it was merely a kind of, but I was thinking about, when you were saying about accessing historic parts, I was thinking the relationship between that and intergenerational trauma is huge too, is that, as you said, that giving that voice to a community's experience and a kind of genetic experience as well, as a way of seeing that maybe. But I really enjoyed it, Hannah.
That's really kind, thank you. There's so much more. I think we're just at the beginnings, which is very exciting. But sometimes a bit, frustrating, but I think mainly exciting. Thanks. I think Madeline's got her hand up.
Hi, thanks. I studied at Anthropology at uni, and I'm now a person-centered counsellor. That was really great, very interesting talk. Something that the bit of anthropology that I find the most interesting these days is Indigenous anthropologists studying white culture, that, you know, Western culture, and this, how sort of flipping this idea of who's the subject of study and who is doing the studying and who the experts are. And I think that there's a really interesting parallel with what we're trying to do in the pluralistic movement, which is, you know, that the counsellor is not the expert and the client isn't the subject, in the same way as, you know, who's the anthropologist and who's the expert and who's the subject. That's been an assumption, you know, the certain type of person is in the role of power, and everybody else is the object of their their beneficent empathy and support, or their kindly study, or, you know, and sort of getting rid of those old ideas.
I mean, that's absolutely wonderful, Madam, and thank you so much. I mean, it's one of those things I would love to have been able to kind of look at a bit more of that, but thank you so much for bringing that, because that's just, it's really interesting to think about, you know, kind of changing those things. And I think that's a really important point about, you know, I think looking at some of the early anthropologists and things, there was a, you know, I think it's not a criticism of them. I think there genuinely is, you know, people like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, and genuinely had an ethical issue. But, you know, it's always interesting is the way in which, well, I'm very happy to talk about people, but no, I don't want them coming with me to talk about themselves. I'm not saying a lot of people do that, but, you know, this sense in which, you know, kind of, I'm going to write about people, but they can't read what I write about them, because this is academia, and that difference. But I think, but what's also interesting is I think is also coming into, particularly from a kind of reflexive research position, is this role of kind of perhaps congruence. And I think where congruence is, so there's a kind of famous case with an anthropologist called Bronislaw Malinowski, who did a lot of work with the Trobriand Islanders, and wrote some kind of, you know, The Argonauts of the West Pacific is a hugely influential book. And actually, when his diaries were published, he actually was pretty unpleasant. Very unpleasant man, particularly about, well, not going to say, you know, but he actually, you know, he didn't, you know, it wasn't a neutral experience. There were times when he was extremely annoyed with the people that he was working at, you know. So this idea that one can be this entirely neutral observer is, you know, that actually, you know, because I'm a Westerner and I'm scientific, I can just accurately capture different, you know, it's just nonsense. You know, and Napoleon Chagnon was the same, although Napoleon Chagnon, I think, was more congruent about his work, in that he said, I used to get really frustrated with them, and there was a time when I was collecting genealogies and I found out after a lot of work that they lied to me, so this was all useless. So then he worked through his way around it, was, well, then what I found I had to do is I had to ask people who didn't like other people, and then I might actually get the truth. So, you know, it's really, really fascinating, you know, stuff. But I think in psychotherapy as well, in research, particularly within qualitative research, there's a kind of a, you know, a lot more reflexivity. And I really loved your paper, Nicola, about, you know, how you work with Billy, and that, you know, actually these are people collaborating together, you know. And I think that's really, you know, actually seeing that as something that's really, you know, it's really valuable and important. And I think there are a few more papers now that are starting to do this, where people actually are working with their clients and writing together. It's important. I think that's our time up. But thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate that. That's really, I will be scribbling frantically. Thank you. That's great.